tonight then. We're honored to have Dr. Randy Guliuzza with us from the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Guliuzza spoke at Lutheran High School this afternoon to 600 students and did just a wonderful job. So I know that you're in for a treat tonight. He's a very captivating speaker. He's represented ICR in several scientific debates at secular universities and other forums. Dr. Guliuzza has a BS in engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines and technology, a BA in theology from Moody Bible Institute, and an MD from the University of Minnesota, and also a Master of Public Health from Harvard University. He has 9 years in the Navy Civil Engineer Corps and is a registered professional engineer. In 2008, he retired as a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, where he served as 28th Bomb Wing Flight Surgeon and Chief of Aerospace Medicine. So please welcome Dr. Guliuzza.
Well, thank you so very much for coming out. I can tell you, I've really been looking forward to it. Can everybody hear this okay?
Yeah.
Good. To tonight's talk and tomorrow's for months and months, because I'm talking to people who are really creation savvy. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. We're all creation savvy here. We're not a bunch of neophytes, and so we're going to talk about some brand new information. And you know, when people look at the data, you actually have to run it through a framework. You have to run it through a model of how you're going to explain it. And we're going to come up with a whole new model tonight for looking at adaptation. And about a third of the way through, I'm going to jump into a little bit of what Darwin did to change the way we look at biology altogether. So hopefully everything I'm talking about tonight is not going to be leftovers or reruns or anything else. It should be completely new. So replacing Darwin's sacred imposter, or this would be another topic, we could just call the same talk, doing biology as if Darwin had never been born. Now, how many would love to do biology that way? I would too. That's not my phrase. That was actually a phrase of this man who works for Discovery Institute. His name is Paul Nelson. He's really a good guy. And he's the one who said that we need to do biology as if Darwin had never been born. But nobody's come up with that yet. So even tonight, as we start to plow new ground, we'll end up backtracking a little bit on some things that we've taught in the past, we as creationists, and then we're going to go move forward with some new data and some new information, and I hope the examples that we'll cover will really be edifying to you and how we're going to explain this. Now the key is that, adaptation. Why is adaptation so important? Well, this is easy. If you were as static as the pew you're sitting on, in other words, you couldn't change. Some of you really are static as the pew. I mean, that was almost like a joke. You're supposed to say, no, I'm not static. I'm not static at all. Then could a theory of evolution ever get going? The answer is no. If you're static, nothing could evolve. But since nobody is static, and no creature is static, but that we are actually able to do this, adapt, then somebody can imagine that if you can adapt a little bit, then maybe you can adapt what? A lot. And that's what Darwin does. So he's taking this wonderful capability that has been built into every creature, and he has kind of perverted it. That we can go and he can try to explain the diversity of life on Earth today. So whoever controls the explanation for adaptation is controlling the creation evolution discussion. That's why it's important. And so far, Darwin has been controlling the discussion. And we, as creationists, have only been saying, yeah, what Darwin is saying is right, but it just can't do everything that Darwin says. Wrong answer. We need to backtrack altogether and come up with a both biblically and scientifically consistent explanation for adaptation. And it's going to be based on the fact that God is the creator and he is the designer. So it's going to be a design-based explanation for adaptation. So it is going to be an explanation that's based on engineered adaptability. So we're not going to just talk about adaptation. We're going to go even through some basics of some engineering. That if this is true, if that the Lord has really designed us, then we're going to be able to adapt, and we should be able to explain it in many ways in which we look at adaptation. And over the last several years, ICR, and I've pretty much been hitting this up, has come up with an alternative explanation for adaptation called continuous environmental tracking, which is radically different than mutations and natural selection. It's radically different from that. And basically, this was a scientific poster I've presented at several scientific conferences. We're not going to go over it. In fact, you can't even read it unless you really have highly evolved peepers here. But we presented this to all these creationists that presents a completely different explanation for how organisms are adapting. And the main premise is this. What organisms are doing is they were designed to track environmental changes over time. And the Earth has always been a dynamic place right from the very beginning. The Earth was not static either. You're not static. The Earth was never static. And there's a reason for that. Because the revelation, general revelation in creation, is revealing the nature of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the Creator. Now tell me, what takes more engineering genius? To build a pew or to build a highly dynamic thing? A dynamic thing. Something that could actually, if needed to, could go to the moon and back all on its own. That's what the creation is revealing, is this incredible genius of the Lord Jesus Christ to build these things. So if we are going to build a design-based explanation, a design-based theory of biological adaptation, everybody has to come up with certain assumptions. And this is an assumption right here of this theory, that biological function is going to be accurately explained by engineering principles. That's a radical departure already, but it's totally biblical. Now, why would I suggest that engineering principles should be able to explain biological design, other than the fact that it really does? Well, if you turn to the book of Romans, open up to chapter 1, it says that we can see what of God? Invisible things. It says, for the invisible things of Him are what? Clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood by the things that are what? Made. Made. So immediately we have design-based talk. We understand invisible things of God from what? Creation. Things that are created, and more specifically, things that are made. Now that word for made is used only one other time in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, where it says, we are His workmanship. We are His workmanship created in Christ Jesus. So this is saying that we understand invisible things of God by looking at His workmanship. It also says in Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His what? Handiwork. And we are the work of His hands. In fact, almost a dozen times in the Scripture, it is saying specifically that we are workmanship. We are handiwork. That is really important. How does anybody on this planet know what handiwork is unless we can understand what handiwork is by the things that we, human beings, have made? So we look at things that human beings have made, and we clearly see features of design. The Lord is saying we can recognize Him as designer by looking at His handiwork. Well, if His handiwork was so radically different than our handiwork, this is really important, speaking to the creation savvy group. In other words, if living things operated so differently than man-made things that we could never figure out how they operated, would that be any witness at all to the creativity of the Lord? No, because it would be undesirable. You couldn't figure them out. So I could say, it looks like biological things are designed, but if we couldn't figure them out, then you could say, well, they evolved. And you could say, it's magic. And you could say, space aliens. Who's right? Who knows? But if living things operate with corresponding principles, corresponding parts, corresponding elements, corresponding systems to man-made things, and they do, then evolution's kind of out. Space aliens is out. Magic is out, but design is what? In. And so living things, you can anticipate it biblically, are going to have these same corresponding elements. They're just going to be much, much better. So here's a car made by who? General Motors. That car has no driver. Now we're all familiar with these things now, these driverless cars. But this car, look, it's studded full of all of these sensors and recorders. This car, it could drive from San Francisco to New York City. It could drive around traffic jams. It could drive around bad weather. It could drive around all this kind of stuff because it can detect those things and it can download data. It can gather data and all those kinds of things. This right here is a guinea pig, and it has corresponding parts. In fact, this has all kinds of data, sensors. It has logic. It has output mechanisms to track everything around it. And so does this guinea pig here. Look at the headline. Guinea pigs beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA. Here's a new thought. Your DNA is not static. Your DNA can be modified in real time. Write that down. DNA can be modified in real time. I thought I was static. I'm not static. I'm dynamic. And DNA can be modified. How does it do it? You detect things, information comes in, you adjust it so that you can have output response. So they took this guinea pig here. I'm always going to tell you what biologists do. I don't do this stuff. So these biologists do this. You take this guinea pig and you want to know if it's going to respond to hotter climates. So what do? You put it in a cage, you put a hot pad that can heat the bottom of the cage under it. And if anybody knows male guinea pig anatomy, what's sitting on the hot plate on there, and you roast them for 70 days. The time it makes one whole cycle of sperm. Then this guinea pig mates with female guinea pigs, and she has offspring, and in one generation, offspring have upregulated 12 different sets of genes which enable them to live in what? Hotter temperatures. Does that sound like this thing is tracking environmental changes? It is tracking it. It is tracking it. So what kind of sensors does this baby have? Heat sensors, plus a bunch of other sensors. And it has mechanisms to adjust these things in real time by the exact same elements as man-made tracking systems. So if you build a tracking system to track moving targets like planes or ships or things like that, and organisms are not tracking planes and ships, but we're tracking moving targets of all the changing environments, then we would expect to have corresponding elements, such as sensors. Make sense? If you're going to track a change, you have a sensor, some kind of computer, logic mechanism, and some way to adjust. If you don't have those three elements, nothing can track. You need every one of those to have a tracking system. Well, guess what? Organisms have these exact same things at the cellular level. On the outside surface of your cells, you have sensors by the thousands. Inside the cell, you have logic mechanisms, not just in the DNA, but it is being processed before it ever gets to the DNA, and you have output responses. You have this on your cells. You have this on your organs. You have this on your organ systems, and you have it on you as an entire organism. You have it from the ground up in order to track all of these changes. It's quite remarkable. And the elements correspond to man-made elements, and they're used in the exact same way as man-made elements. Now it's getting harder and harder to argue against design when you have these corresponding features, and they're being used in the exact same way. So, if we're going to develop a theory, since I'm talking to a creation savvy group, we want to develop a theory, we might ask the question, what are organisms doing as we watch them over time? Well, they seem to be able to track environmental changes, and you notice the word there is continuously track. That means right now, bang, you're tracking changes. If I were to shoot a gun, boom, catch you by surprise, your heart rate would go up. An instantaneous tracking of changes. You could do it if I took you to a high mountain here and kept you up there for a couple of weeks. You would acclimate to the higher altitude. We hauled you up to Pikes Peak on that. And you can pass on some of those changes to your offspring. So it's a continuous tracking of all these changes. And how they do it is not through, notch this down, not through a mechanism, it's through dozens of mechanisms that the Lord has designed, enabling these creatures to track all these changes, all different varieties. So hopefully already in the first 10 minutes, I have laid on you creation savvy people new thoughts that we've never really been discussing as creationists in the past, but we need to discuss them. And as we do the research, we are able to identify the characteristics of these changes of organisms. As it says there up on the screen, when organisms track these changes, they do it rapidly. They do it repeatedly. They have mechanisms that do it in highly regulated fashions. Some of these things are even reversible. And the output responses are so precise, and they fit the change conditions so precisely, they're even predictable. Now, do these words sound like evolution or design? Design. In fact, since I'm talking to the creation savvy crowd, not only do they sound like design, they sound like anti-evolutionary words. I mean, is evolution supposed to be unregulated or regulated? Unregulated. Is it supposed to be slow and gradual or rapid? Slow and gradual. Is it supposed to be repeatable? No. Predictable? No. It's not supposed to be any of those things. So what Darwin really did, and we'll get to this in a second, his theory, stomp this down, his theory was not meant to explain just the diversity of life. His theory was to explain the design we see in creatures without a designer. And we have been missing this for the longest time. His theory is really an anti-design theory. And that's exactly what Francis Ayala said. This is a headline from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Darwin's greatest discovery is design without a designer. So, new change thought creationists, Darwin's theory is not just supposed to explain the evolution of life. Darwin's theory is to explain why I look so incredibly designed. That's not a joke. I look incredibly designed here. Why I can look so incredibly designed, but I did not have a designer. And so Darwin's theory is an anti-theistic explanation, but he doesn't just come out and say, there is no God. He's not come out and just saying there is no God. He's going back one step, and it's actually more important. He's saying there is no designer. There is no creator. You see why that's anti-God? Because God fundamentally is what? The designer and the creator. So he's explaining design without a designer. How many of you recognize this gentleman? I'm sure you do. His name's Stephen Jay Gould. This was in his younger years when he was on faculty at Harvard. And he asked a really important question. And creationists have been missing this. What is the motor of organic change? Or, more specifically, how are life and earth related? Does the external environment and its alterations set the course of change, or does change arise from some independent and internal dynamic within organisms themselves? That is fundamental, and this is what Darwin's going to change. I have been designed to relate to the environment. You've been designed to relate to the environment. I can change over time, and so can you. How and why am I changing? Does my ability to change and why I'm changed, does it arise from within, or does it come from the environment itself? He goes on to say, and this is his major book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, Darwin basically devised a fundamentally anti-design explanation. And that's what evolutionary theory really is. It's anti-design. And in this book, Structure of Evolutionary Theory, and I've pretty much read this whole book, and most evolutionists haven't. About a third of the way through, he spends over 100 pages describing what Darwin changed. And if you don't know what he changed, then you won't know how to respond to it. And very, very few evolutionists know what Darwin did, and very few creationists did. And so Gould said this, I proceed in this way in a very principled manner, and not merely as convenience. All evolutionary theories before Darwin, so Darwin wasn't the first to come up with evolutionary theory, but they are presenting a fundamentally internalist account based on the intrinsic and predictable patterns set by the nature of living systems for the development of unfolding through time. In other words, before Darwin, even people who believed that organisms could evolve were saying, please don't miss this, and thank you for the appropriate attention, colleague Rain, that they did it through internal mechanisms. Why is that important? Because as an engineer, long before I went to medical school, you design things. And everything you design, you build the capabilities into it. It's internal. This computer thing right here, are the capabilities in this baby or out of it? In it. How much of its capabilities are in it? All of it. All of it. And if you don't build them in up front, it won't ever have them. So this is internalism. It's internalism. And before Darwin, people explained it internalistically. The problem with that is it sounds way too much like what? Design. It sounds way too much like design. So, Darwin's theory in what? Strong and revolutionary contrast presents the first externalist account of evolution. Darwin overturned all previous traditions by thus granting the external environment a causal and controlling role in the direction of evolutionary change. Bang! This was worth the price of admission. Hardly anybody recognizes what Darwin did. And he did it because we, I'll stand in front of the screen again, are able to relate to our environment. So when the environment changes, I change. I change because of what's inside of me. Darwin said, no, you change because of what's happening where? Outside of you. That's what he fundamentally changed. And if internalism is fundamentally design-based, externalism is the anti-design explanation for that. Is that kind of clear? Now, this gentleman right here is Stephen Jay Gould's colleague, Richard Lewontin, a young one. He's an old guy now. But he goes on to explain what Darwin did even clearer. For Darwin, the external world, the environment, acting on organisms, was the cause of the form of organisms. The environment, the external world with its autonomous properties, was the subject, and the organism was again the object acted upon. It was from this view of environment as the cause of organism. He doesn't just say the cause of your traits. He says it's what? The cause of organism. That means externalism goes all the way back to the origin of life. And as the environments work on, act on, so-and-so and so-and-so creatures. It's building creatures. And that this is the entire corpus of modern biology. And I swear there's some in here today who think, not some, probably most of you, think exactly like it. Because this is how we're taught. And this is how every university in this state will teach it. The environment molds you and shapes you and forms you. This is how they will teach it. We cannot fully appreciate the nature of the change in biology wrought by Mendel through what? Genetics, and Darwin through evolution, unless we understand the historical importance of the objectification of the organism. These two gentlemen right here, I'm going to go back to Gould. He therefore said externalists identify the agent of change, not within organisms themselves, but in the fluctuating external environment. So the agent of change is that, and Kirshner and Gerhardt, in their really seminal book, The Plausibility of Life, they go on to explain this even further. He, speaking of Darwin, accepted the view that the environment directly instructs the organism how to vary, and he proposed a mechanism for inheriting those changes. The organism was like modeling clay, and remolding the clay meant that each of the billions of little grains was free to move in a little bit in any direction to generate form. This is where, if we don't learn anything else, this is it. Darwin changed the view of organisms from this. Active, problem-solving creatures taking on their environment and solving problems, to what? Passive modeling clay. So that I am now shaped and molded by the environment. Now, how does he do that? How in the world could he pull off such a change? Let's back up one slide right here. He accepted the view that the environment directly instructs the organism how to vary. Is that true? The answer is no. It's not even. How in the world can the environment instruct me? Where's my instruction detector out here? You see, this is why I'm saying we, even as creationists, have bought into this. He is personifying the environment. He's personifying the environment. Why? Because there was an agent who designed creatures. That agent was the Lord Jesus Christ, who has will and volition and power, just like any engineer does. And he is going to get the Lord's agency out, and he's going to put in a substitute agent in its place. What is the substitute agent? The environment. The environment becomes the substitute agent. And he makes it palatable to people because he consistently personifies the environment as if it could act like a human, or is as if it could act like God. So therefore he says this kind of stuff. The environment directly instructs it. And you know how many people on this planet read through that stuff and they don't even give it a second thought? The vast, vast majority. And we shouldn't. Now, how did he actually get this whole idea of personification? He came up with this concept called nature selects. Nature selects. Now, he came up with that idea by comparing nature to what a breeder could do. A breeder can select for certain pigeons. A breeder can select for roses. A breeder can select for these kinds of things. A breeder can do that because a breeder has a real brain. A breeder has real volition. And he said, well, maybe nature is like a breeder. And nature, therefore, is selecting for you and not selecting for you, selecting for you, not selecting for you, selecting for you, not selecting for you. And therefore nature is slowly building creatures over time by selecting for the traits that nature wants. Is that true? No. No. Nature is full of living things, but is nature alive? No. Can nature act? Can nature favor? Can nature cull? Can nature weed out? No. But you have been reading these words, even written by creationists, for decades, and every single one of them is a personification of nature, ascribing to nature capabilities that it doesn't have. And it's so subtle, and it is so clever that it could almost be demonic. Now, is that also biblical that maybe Darwin would do this? Yes, it is. We go back to Romans chapter 1. It says, invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen by his workmanship. And then it goes on to say, and even as they did not like to glorify him as God, the root for glorify means to credit. To credit. They didn't credit him as creator God. They became vain in their imagination and foolish hearts darkened. And then it goes on to say, and they worshipped and served the creation more than the creator. So you've gone from God creates nature to nature creates God. Subtly. It's this complete inversion. And he does it by this constant personification. So, environment directly instructs, but you will see it more often in other ways where it says, you're here, but you're not here. No, you're here, but you're not here. That's because the environment favored you. How many times have you ever heard that? The environment favored this. The environment called, the environment acted on, the environment worked on, the environment weeded out, and on ad nauseum. You find this personification of nature, and none of it is real. It's all there. And that's what we need to do if we're going to do biology if Darwin never been born, is we get completely, totally away from this idea that organisms are modeling clay, being shaped by their environment, and we completely reject the bottom line conclusion of that, which Helena Cronin in Great Britain said, all of this apparent design. Why is she using the word apparent design? Do I look like I'm apparently designed? Of course not. She says, I'm apparently designed because real design would demand a real designer. But if there is no real designer, then I'm only appeared like I was designed by nature. There you go. By nature is without a designer. No purpose, no goals, no blueprints, natural selection, the substitute. And when you see natural selection, just think nature selects. Nature selects. It's simply about genes replicating themselves in all those generations. Well, if all of that is wrong, and if what Darwin did to flip everything on its head was to go from internalism to externalism, how would we respond to that today if we really wanted to respond as if to do biology if Darwin had never been born? What should we do? We should go from externalism back to what? Internalism. That's what we should do. We go back from nature designs me to I am designed within myself by the great creator who designed me. So, characteristics can really distinguish between random and purposeful processes there. So, we could talk for days about areas of design. And I just want to pick one area of observable convergences. Not that magical convergence that evolution has taught us out, but real convergences, where we see organisms tend to converge on things. Now, Jonathan Losos, he was in Harvard University. He's the world's leading researcher on guess what animal? Lizards. Yeah, there you go. We're not in Texas, so we don't have to have all these clues. He's a world leading researcher on lizards. So he wrote this whole book on how lizards have adapted over time. But he makes an interesting statement in his book. In recent years, scientists have identified convergence in almost any type of trait you can imagine. Now, how is it that all these different kinds of creatures can converge on similar traits? Magic? Random changes? Or maybe they have design features. So, if continuous environmental tracking is true, and organisms have sensors, and they have logic, and they have suitable responses, if they, with their sensors, they were able to detect similar conditions, and if this logic had similar programming, then maybe I should expect similar responses. So here's an example. This is a cave. This is a challenging environment. What if creatures, when they found themselves in a cave, what if they were programmed to lose their eyes, lose their pigmentation, change their circadian rhythms, augment their wakefulness, taste, smell, and all these other senses that they have? What if they were programmed to do that? So the loss of eyes wasn't due to any mutations or anything like that. What if it was intentional? If that was intentional, then maybe you wouldn't find just blind cave fish. You could find blind salamanders, insects, crayfish, and dozens of other creatures that lose their pigmentation, lose their eyes, and augment those things when they find themselves in caves. Oh, feel free to say, wow, I didn't know that all these different kinds of creatures could do that. But they do. Look at them. They're all hypopigmented, no eyes and all of these kinds of things. Now what's the silly story we've been taught, and we as creationists have been teaching? Oh, the fish find their way into the cave, and their eyes are now a hazard. They get what? Bumped and scraped, and they cause diseases. And over long periods of time, mutations lead to the degradation of the eyes. And we would say, but that's not evolution. That's not a gain of information. That's a loss of information. How many of you have heard that? How many of you have ever said it? Don't raise your hand. Isn't that a silly story? How about this? When they get in the cave, they shut down eye production on purpose. On purpose. They decrease their pigmentation on purpose. None of this mutation. Okay, so the silly story I said about creationists and evolutionists, up to the point where you would say it evolved into a different creature, is the evolutionary account any different than the creationist account? The old way? Evolutionists would say mutations, like the beneficial, many mutations, lose your eyes. Creationists would say what? Same thing. This is an anti-evolutionary explanation. This is going back to, is this stuff external or internal? Internal. This is going back to internalism. Here's another one. Look at this paper. It's about snakes, which turn into giants or dwarfs. The snakes live on the mainland of Australia, and they can migrate to these islands, and within just a few generations, they become giants or dwarfs. What does it say in the headline? Rapid and what? Repeated origin of these giants and dwarfs. And they do this consistently. And what's interesting is if you take the mainland states, the giants and the dwarfs, and you compare them genetically, they're almost genetically identical. Identical. Where's the mutations? Where's all that random stuff? Where's that silliness that we know put out with evolutionary theory? It's gone. Is that they're able to detect something on these islands, and they go to giants and dwarfs. And it's not just snakes. We've known about this for long periods of time. When organisms find themselves trapped on these islands, look at this little chameleon here. Dwarf? Yeah, really dwarfy. It's on the head of a match. We've known that dinosaurs went from that when they were trapped on islands, from large to dwarfs. This elephant here is only waist high. Waist high. And you can find these skeletons on Sicily and other places like that, and other things. They're detecting something about the environment, and they are adjusting themselves consistently to go to these dwarfs. Okay, here's an interesting one on these rove beetles. How many of you recognize the beetle? How many of you recognize the ants over here? But those aren't ants. This is a beetle that morphs into the shape of these ants. And these are specifically army ants. Now, nobody wants to get involved with army ants because they generally what? Eat everything up. But when this beetle detects the presence of these ants, it morphs into the shape of the ant. Look at this. Here's a beetle, here's the ant, here's a beetle, here's an ant, here's a beetle, an ant. They morph into the shape of the ant. Not only do they look like the ants, but they smell like the ants, and they behave like the ants. And the ants accept them into their colony, and they take care of the brood of the ants, but not beneficially. It's like 2 for you, 1 for me. And they eat the little brood of these ants all over there. And they change. This is a beetle, but it's morphed into the shape of an ant. Now that's kind of a wow moment. I mean, that's pretty impressive to do such that. And not only does it just do one species of ant, it can morph into 9 different species of ant. Wow, that's quite incredible of how it's doing that. Well, how does it do that? Is it gaining lots of mutations over time? Or can it sense the army ants and morph? It senses them, and it morphs into those. Look what this paper said. The researchers, proposed that the beetles, quote, are poised for mimecrophilia, that is to look like an ant, and that this near clade-wide pre-adaptive ground plan may underlie repeated ant mimicry. Now stop right there, creation-savvy people. Is evolution ever supposed to be poised for anything? No. Is it supposed to have a pre-adaptive ground plan? The answer is no. But if organisms are tracking environmental changes, pre-adaptive ground plan would be a pretty good thing to have. This American Academy of Sciences report about these same ants said this, these beetles. This discovery, published in Current Biology, provides evidence that evolution, they throw that in, has the capacity to repeat itself in astonishingly predictable ways. Stop right there. Is that even consistent with evolutionary theory? No, it's not. Would it be consistent with the theory that organisms are tracking their environmental changes? Yes, it is. It's highly predictable. Here's another example. 2018, repeated diversification ecomorphs of Hawaiian stick spiders. Now, these researchers are suffering for science in Hawaii. And what they found is, you have these stick spiders. This is the gold stick spider, but there's a brown morph, there's a white morph. This gold one lives on leaves. Brown ones live on the trunks of trees, and white ones live on lichens. And what these researchers found is, you take a gold one here, and it migrates to another Hawaiian island, and it will morph into the brown and white forms before the brown and white forms on this island get to this island. That's quite amazing, but it does that. The researcher said, we don't usually expect evolution to be what? Predictable. But Hawaiian stick spiders of the Rhamnus genus have repeatedly evolved, why don't we just say adapted? Adapted the same distinctive forms known as ecomorphs on different islands. How in the world could they do such a thing? The spiders, she goes on to say, arrive on an island and boom, you get independent evolution to the same forms. This sort of rapid and repeated evolution. Now, what things are contrary to evolutionary theory here? Well, one thing is boom. I mean, evolution is not supposed to be boom, is it? No, it's supposed to be, it's just supposed to be iterative and slow. Like a little fuse just burning along. How about this? Repeated, predictable, same forms. How about this? Rapid. Rather than just saying, wow, these stick spiders defy evolution, let's come up with something better. Let's come up with an explanation that explains why they're doing this and frame it, how they're having this. We can ask, Gillespie says, we can ask whether there might be an underlying mechanism that leads to similar patterns of predictably repeated evolution in the course of this radiation. I mean, underlying mechanism? Is evolution supposed to have any underlying mechanisms? That the arachnid spiders have some sort of pre-programmed switch in their DNA that can turn them into these things on them. Pre-programmed switches? This says a lot. First of all, evolutionary theory is so plastic that can absorb any observation, even contradictory ones, and never miss a beat. Just keeps running right over. But, pounding this, we're savvy creationists, aren't we? I asked you at the beginning of the talk, how many of you are savvy creationists? You all raised your hands. Some of you raised 2 hands on that. We're all savvy creationists. We don't just want to say this defies evolution. We want to explain it in terms of design. Isn't that better? Yes. So, these spiders seem to be able to rapidly track these changes. Here's another cool example. Lizards on newly created islands independently and what? Rapidly adapt to morphology and diet. So here, this is in Brazil. There was a river. They put a dam in, rapidly flooded this place. We do it all the time. All of these islands used to be connected to the mainland, and it rapidly flooded them off. Once it did that, they were obviously monitoring lizards. Some of the bigger lizards went to extinct, and smaller lizards, which used to be deprived the ability to eat the termites, suddenly can start eating the termites. Except the termites are really big, and you're kind of small. So what do these lizards do in less than 15 years, and nobody knows how fast they did it because they went back 15 years later? Their head size to body length greatly increased compared to those on the mainland. And they didn't just do it on one island, they did it on all the islands in exactly the same way. That's quite amazing. The paper went on to say that this is, quote, strong evidence that changes are, these are their words, predictably, and what? Precisely. In ecological communities that illustrate that populations can respond both what? Rapidly and in parallel. There's a new one. When was evolution supposed to have parallel changes? No, but if organisms are tracking their environment and they have similar programming, then I'm expecting parallel changes. Is everybody following? Okay. Oh, we're back to Jonathan Losos. He does research on these lizards, and he suffers for science in the Caribbean. That's what the researcher does. And he's been studying these lizards, all kinds of lizards, on all these Caribbean islands. Well, in 2004, a natural experiment came up, which was kind of cool. A hurricane came through and killed all the lizards on the 7 islands. All the lizards are gone. And the islands had vegetation which was like what we would probably say like sagebrush. Short, scrubby type of vegetation. So Losos, this was a cool idea, he went to an island where the lizards were living in big, tall trees. And he got those lizards, and he went back to the islands with the scrubby vegetation, and he repopulated the islands with these lizards. The thing is, lizards that walk on trees have big, long legs. Lizards that walk on scrubby sagebrush have short little legs. And he said, our prediction, stop right there. Is evolution supposed to be predictable? No. Was that they would evolve, change that word to what? Adapt, shorter legs. And what? And they did. Over the course of 40 years. Average leg length steadily declined on all 7 islands exactly as predicted. And this is even better. All 7 islands were evolving in lockstep. That sounds like maybe there's a program. There's a program in these creatures. They're enabling to do all of that. This guy, Esquire, he does work on what? Snakes. Now this is cool. Pythons and boas, supposedly separated by over 60 million years of evolution. One has live young, one lays eggs. But they live in similar environments. Some live in trees on the ground, partially on the tree and partially on the ground, some in water and some under the ground. Look at that. Boas and pythons that live in trees, they're green. Look at their head shape. They look more like each other than a python looks like another python living underground. Look at their head shapes. Look at their coloration. Look at their forms. Look at all of these things. These pythons and boas are able to detect what? What environment they're in, and their entire form modifies so that it fits that environment. Oh, what else was there? Evolution can still be what? Predictable. Opie Hoekstra. She's probably the world's leading researcher on mice from Harvard University. This was an interesting find. You take mice that are living out here in the prairies of Nebraska, Kansas, and those kinds of things, and those mice either migrate or you transplant them to forests on the East Coast and forests on the West Coast. In just a few generations, I don't know exactly why they do this, but the tail length of mice living in forests compared to tail length of those living in the prairie increases dramatically. How does it increase? It not only increases the length of the vertebrae, the tail has more vertebrae in it. So it increases the number of vertebrae and the length of the vertebrae, so you get these longer tails. What does a longer tail do if you're living in a tree? In fact, I've never even seen mice living in a tree. I grew up in Wyoming. I'm in South Dakota right now. The mice I see live where? On the ground. But I've never even seen them living in trees. But they can. Mice are pretty adaptable. And then they go on to say, from a short-tailed, prairie-dwelling ancestor. Some of you probably have had those too. Prairie-dwelling ancestors. From geographically distinct populations across North America, longer tails have what? Evolved repeatedly in similar forest habitat. And they do it by increasing that. And by the way, it says trait for vertebral length and number are controlled by separate genes. Separate genes. They go on to suggest that this indicates that it's not a random process, but implicates similar mechanisms of tail elongation in all of those populations. They're able to track their changes clearly. Oh, what about bacteria? First of all, this is Nature, world's leading scientific journal. Look at the headline, the title of this paper. Predictable evolution trumps randomness of mutations. It trumps it. On that. This was published before Trump trumped. This is 2013. But just stop. Does that even make any sense from an evolutionary standpoint? No. Predictable evolution trumps randomness. Let's look at this quote. Although mutations, the driver of evolution, occur at random. Stop right there. How many of you have heard that mantra over and over again? Mutations are random, mutations are random. Has anybody ever demonstrated that? No. That you can't. How do you know if it was random or not? But you say it because it's important to evolutionary theory. A study of the bacteria E. coli reveals that nature, see if you can see any personification here, nature often finds the same solution. Is that a personification? How many of you would have read right through that an hour ago? But now we spot the personification. Can nature find anything? No, because nature's not alive. Anyway, nature finds the same solution again and again. They subjected these E. coli to changes in conditions, and even though they're in separate populations, they coming up with the exact same solutions to the problems. Okay, since we're creation savvy, how might you explain this? Is nature finding the solution to the same problem, or what might you say? It's already in them. It's already in them, so that when they detect similar things, they respond in what? Similar ways. Identical mutations appeared independently in all 3 test tubes. Identical mutations? What's the probability of that happening by chance? I mean, that's crazy on there. Bacteria such as E. coli can acquire predictable mutations. This doesn't even make sense. To adapt to changing environment. Maybe even bacteria are able to track their changes. In fact, I would say not even maybe, probably the best creatures on this planet to track changes are bacteria. Are bacteria. On that, this is really cool. So how might we explain this? What might happen? Well, we'll come up with some explanations. Look at the blind cavefish. Let's reject once and for all that silly story about the eyes being bumped and scratched and becoming a detriment to mutations leading to loss of eyes and blah, 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 blah. Dump that once and for all. Because these researchers, and this is just one way, in 2014 reported on cryptic variation, which was revealed by heat shock protein 90. The bottom line is this. You can go from sided and pigmented to non-sided and hypopigmented in 1 generation. One generation. And it's a graded response. And these fish are able to detect them when they're in a cave. What do you think they're looking for? Light? Darkness? Ah, that's what I thought. I wrote a paper, in actual fact, predicting that we'd be able to find this 2 years before this paper was published. And I suspected that they were looking for light and darkness. It kind of makes sense. But what these fish are able to detect, mama lays her eggs in the water, they're able to detect water conductivity, the ability to conduct electricity, which is different between cave water and stream water. So, yeah, it's remarkable. As they're developing as an egg, they detect this. They detect they're in a cave. Cave? Boom. Go to that. That's quite good. Losos. He had an interesting experiment. He did this in 2005. He took lizards, newly hatched, just newly hatched lizards, 120 of them, and he divided them up randomly into different aquaria. On these, they grew up on white boards, which mimicked tree trunks. And in the other aquaria, he had dowel rods, which mimicked little narrow twiggy things. And by the time these lizards reached maturity, not over many generations, just by the time they reached adulthood, the ones that are on boards had longer legs, the ones that are on twigs had shorter legs. We need to dump once and for all that whole silly story about what random mutations accumulating, being selected by the personified environment. How might they do it? He doesn't know. I'll suggest a solution. Mechanical sensors. You have them all over your body, and they're able to detect mechanical stresses. And they can remodel your own bones right now. If I put your head in a little vise, over a few months, it would remodel to that, because everything is dynamic. This is probably why these lizards are able to sense the stresses on their legs and modify the expression of their genes in real time. That's probably how it's done. This gentleman works in Boston, and he does work on these fish called cichlids. And he noticed, as they're developing, that these tiny little developing fish open and close their mouth really, really rapidly, 200 times a minute, just as they're developing. He wondered, why in the world do they do that? So he mechanically wired their mouth shut, so they can't do that. And by the time they reached adulthood, the cranium of those that had their mouth mechanically closed compared to the normal ones was different. Their orbit was different. Their entire face was different because of this. And he goes on to say, this is a paper reporting on it, this is what's really important. For over 100 years, we've been taught that the ability system to evolve depends largely on the amount of what? Genetic variation that exists for a trait. You have a misprint of them here. I'll show you where it is.
Didn't that change their eating habits?
Well, yeah, it certainly did. On there. Where do they live? Because they're developing from, they have the Yoki system and things like that. Yes, it does. But the key on this is, we do it all ourselves, we talk about the different genes for things. And genes are important, but genes aren't the whole story by any means that exists for a trait. What is ignored or not noted for most traits is that less than 50% of, this should have said phenotypic, your trait variation, can be accounted for by the genetics. Wow. We all thought you're a product of your genes, that you had the good-looking gene or the bad-looking gene or all those other kinds of genes. But it's not. It goes on to say, the idea of how these fish develop is that when an animal population is exposed to a new environment, certain molecules will enable them to respond by conforming their bodies to meet the challenges. No doubt. That's because these organisms are able to rapidly detect these environmental changes and adjust themselves. One last, and then I'll open up for questions. James Shapiro, he's a researcher at the University of Chicago. He's really the one who's been doing most of the research on how DNA is not like read-only memory, but it's more like read-write memory. And he had this interesting paper that came out in 2014. Epigenetic control. Stop right there, I'll explain what it means. You're all aware of genetic control. Genes do control your traits, but that's not the whole story. There's another layer of information called epigenetics, and these are basically markers that are placed on the DNA, or some of the spools that the DNA is wrapped around, and these markers change the expression of those genes. It might shut some genes down, it might let genes run longer, it changes the expression of those genes. That's epigenetic changes. And those markers are being added and changed in real time, right now. So you take two twin astronauts, you send one into space, you keep one on Earth. When they come back, they have thousands of differences in their epigenetic marks, because it's real-time changes. Anyway, this epigenetic control of mobile DNA. Mobile DNA is DNA which is exactly what it says. It's mobile. It can be spliced out of one part of the chromosome and spliced in on another. And when you splice it out and you splice it in, it changes the expression of genes. So all this stuff is allowing you to rapidly change. It's an interface between your experience and your genome change. You need something that links what you're detecting in your environment, that is your experiences, and the expression of your DNA. And he believes, and I think he's right, you have these epigenetic controls. And he goes on to say in the paper that the preceding observations, which he gives loads of examples of this, lead to the plausible hypothesis that epigenetic regulation serves as a key interface between organismal life and the history and the agents that restructure genomic DNA. So there has to be some interface which connects you to your environment. So, take-home messages. Lots. One, since we're creation savvy, I have to do a little quiz. What did Darwin fundamentally change? He changed the way we looked at organisms from how? Internal to external. Internal to external. But all design things have their capability where? Internal. If I send a rocket ship to Mars, and I didn't build the capability for everything it needed to do to leave Earth, go through our atmosphere, go through space, go through Mars' atmosphere, land on Mars, take off from Mars, come all the way back to Earth. If I didn't, and this was an autonomous vehicle, no Houston control. If I didn't build everything into that machine that needed to get from here to Mars and back, would it pick up any capability on the way to Mars? No, it would not. So engineers build the solutions preceding the problems. The solutions are not due to the problems. Solutions must what? precede the problems. Okay, Darwin's theory is fundamentally to do what? Explain why organisms can look designed but weren't designed. Therefore, Darwin's theory is fundamentally an anti-design explanation. He is there to say there is no designer. So, in contrast, we have externalism versus internalism. Now we had characteristics describing changes. Darwin says that changes have to be undirected, but we found that they were highly regulated. Darwin says they have to be slow and gradual, but we found that they were rapid. Darwin says that they're a one-off, but we found that they're often repeatable. Darwin says that the potential solutions have to be so copious. In other words, in this room there has to be a lot of potential solutions so that the one, who is the fittest, has the solution. But we found that rather than having copious solutions, solutions are very targeted, so targeted that they can even be predictable. So what Darwin came up with was a totally anti-design explanation. And what we're seeing here is that capability is internal, and that the way we would characterize it is regulated, rapid, repeatable, sometimes reversible, with solutions that are so targeted they're even predictable. Okay. And then the most important thing, despite all those illustrations I gave to you, is this. We no longer want to see organisms as passive modeling clay being shaped and molded by our environment, which Darwin personifies it. Rather, we want to see organisms as these incredible entities that are able to detect their environmental changes, take on those environmental changes, solve those environmental changes, and be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, just as the Lord designed them to do. No longer passive modeling clay, but active, problem-solving entities. And we can do that. We can come up with a better way of framing it. Well, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for all of that. And I will open it up to questions. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Can you go back 3 slides?
3 slides?
Yes.
To that one? The little ciclet?
Yes. I just wanted to write a note.
No question. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Do we know, is adaptability uniform across a kind? Do we have that information yet? The whole kind?
When you okay, when you say is it uniform, first of all, what do you
somewhat, I mean, is that what we're finding, that there's a uniformity in adaptability across a kind? Do we know about kinds on the earth?
Yeah.
Is it?
Probably. The answer is probably. Probably is uniform. And but the thing is, there is an environmental component in the sense that you detect an environmental condition and then you respond to that. Now, clarification. The evolutionists will say that the environment is the trigger, or the environment is the cue, or the environment induces you. Is the environment ever a trigger or an inducer? No. No. The environment may be a stimulus. It may be a stimulus, but I'll tell you why. Because in order for something to be a stimulus, there has to be something inside of you that specifies a condition to be a stimulus, and then you have to have a sensor for that condition. I'll illustrate. How many of you are being bombarded by AM radio waves right now? Everybody. How many of you are listening to AM radio in your head? Nobody. Therefore, AM radio waves are not a stimulus. even though you're exposed to them, they are not a stimulus to you. In fact, many of your exposures are not a stimulus. There has to be something. This is why everything is internal. As an engineer, if I want something to be a stimulus, I will specify, I want sound, I want light, I want motion, I want something to be a stimulus, I want it to be a stimulus, and then I will equip the thing I'm designing with a sensor specific for that condition. And when I do it, then it becomes a stimulus. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Throughout all these explanations, and you just see it, just left and right, and just appears where they just jump the gun, and they just don't even follow what seems to be, your, I don't know, science 101 scientific model.
Right.
Where you never really arrive at an answer, but then they say evolution did this.
Right.
Without any sort of data. And even with the scientific model, when you find some kind of what we call statistically significant findings, you say, well, we found that it is plausible that this is the case, but they never speak that way. Even your top scientists that would say, oh, we found out that evolution did this, or nature did that. Does anyone ever call them out on that?
They should, but then they don't. The answer is, you're right, they should. And really, when you say this evolved or this happened, a good peer reviewer would circle that and say, explain it. You just can't cover it up with that. You must explain how this happened. How did this happen? But they don't. And so you get that kind of bogus causality in scientific papers all the time.
Yeah, and we see it, especially as we're raising kids, and we teach them creation. You always hear, on documentaries, 10 million years ago, this happened.
Right.
As if, somebody was there filming it and knew exactly what happened, how it happened.
Exactly.
Exactly.
But those are all imaginary things that get credence far beyond what the evidence supports it. Yes, ma'am.
Do the eyeless fish get their eyes back? Has that been observed?
If they went into a stream.
If they went back into a stream, the answer is probably not, that we know of. But there's a mechanism to do that. And remember I said there's many, many, many mechanisms, not just the mechanism for change, but another mechanism. And another mechanism for getting capability back is called hybridization. So if you take a blind cavefish and you mate it with a sighted fish, the offspring will have eyes, and they will function normally. So they can hybridize with sighted fish, and the offspring will have eyes. But whether this is one of those reversible mechanisms or not, when I said probably, I should have said probably not. Probably not, because I don't know if anybody's really done the experiment yet on that. But my gut inclination is it's probably not. Yes, sir. I'm not coming back to you.
A couple of questions, I guess. One is, there's some really remarkable examples you've given, although we also know of a lot of species that are not dynamic in that way whatsoever, as far as I know. Is that not the case? I mean, like, for instance, human beings don't seem to be able to adapt in the kinds of ways we're describing here. The males in my family are kind of all about the same. We don't, I haven't gotten taller because I have taller ceilings in my house. And, so is the theory that this just applies to certain types of species, that God has given these kind of adaptable traits to just particular species?
Well, the variation and the types are going to be different from one type of creature or kinds of creature to the other on that. But, humans do change, and humans do adapt over time.
Individual organisms?
Yeah, individuals and as a population, we do adapt over time. And we actually have some quite remarkable adaptations as well for things. So,
What are some examples of those?
well, the height that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Humans are actually taller. I don't think it's because we're detecting a higher ceiling or something like that.
But that's not individuals, that's from generation to generation.
Well, no. Let me give you an example. So if you take human beings and you put mom or dad in a starvation condition, these are actual documented things. It happened with Dutch women when the Nazis starved them. And it happened in the United States when food was scarce right after World War II. In this case, and it happened in China, in one of their great ideas to increase productivity, which led to a massive famine from 1959 to 1962, where over 30 million Chinese starved to death. And I figured out finally, that's why my mom was saying to me as a kid, eat everything on your plate because they're starving Chinese. They really were starving Chinese.
Yeah.
Okay. You look at the children that are born to them, and they are born with what's generally observed to be called a thrifty phenotype. In other words, the children, these are humans, that are born to parents who are in starvation conditions tend to be calorie hoarders. And they tend to hoard those calories as fat there. The trouble was, in China and in the United States particularly, we didn't grow up in a calorie deficient environment. In other words, this is a case where mom is detecting certain conditions. And somehow, while baby's in utero with mom does not change baby, but mom sends signals that baby's able to detect, and baby adjusts itself in real time to make itself a thrifty phenotype as it's expecting to be born in a starvation environment. But it doesn't grow up in a starvation environment. In fact, Americans didn't and the Chinese didn't. They grew up in a calorie-rich environment, and in particularly, this is a study that just came out a couple years ago on the Chinese. Children that were born to parents who were starved have a 75% increased chance of hyperglycemia. The odds of getting type 2 diabetes are 2 to 1 to children who weren't born of starved parents on that. So we do see changes, even in humans, where you have these kind of conditions there.
Right.
So you have, and then here's another one that was done on human beings. You take women who were low birth weight versus heavy birth weight babies. So the heavy birth weight, they're probably in an environmentally rich condition, low birth rate environment, starvation condition. They grow up as adults. You take these women and you put them in a calorie restricted environment and you work them harder. And this, I don't know who were the volunteers for this experiment, but they worked them harder on their job and they worked them harder at their housework. And they predicted in advance that women who had the lower birth rates would have decreased estradiol levels, in other words, decreasing their fertility, and they would have a higher response compared to children who actually had a heavier birth weight. And that's exactly what they found. When you put these women in this condition, those at their low birth rate, their estradiol levels went down, and they had decreased fertility compared to that. So yes, you're not morphing into an ant. But we do have real-time responses that actually cross generations on there. So and also the women that had the decreased estradiol had a lower chance of getting breast cancer in the future. So the moral of the story is, don't help your house with housework, your wife with housework. If you really love her, work her hard. There you go. So there are these, yes, your second question.
Yeah, the second question was, is the secular scientific community kind of excited about these developments? Because to me it seems like, this seems like a better theory for atheism than what they had before, because natural selection, obviously, I mean, we've dwelt on this for a long time, has real liabilities to it, that it doesn't have the power to create new features and so forth, but they're seeing them, and we say the amount of time involved is more, that would be required is more than there is available. But for this, it seems like we're observing in real time things being changed and species being, things really dynamically changing, such that now I like you will recognize that this the level of sophistication we're talking about in the design required to pull that off is magnitudes higher than even what we have been talking about in the past. But for a lot of the people that have bought into evolution, it seems like this almost would make it easier for them to say, well, hey, we don't know how these machines got here, but they intrinsically there's artificial intelligence even in the microscopic informational layer that it allows them to redesign themselves on the spot, just like we're talking about AI in computer systems. I don't know.
I know what you're saying, so let me just answer your questions. The first one you asked was, are evolutionists excited about this? The answer is yes, but not in the way I'm excited about it.
Right.
On that. They're excited because a cadre of them recognize that the things we're describing do not fit with evolutionary theory. There's a cadre that recognize it and they're honest enough, and they're not just going to stretch current theory to absorb these things. And so in 2016, this stuff has been discovered, you probably noticed, for the last 15, 20 years prior to this. There was a meeting in England to discuss whether evolutionary theory needed a complete overhaul or whether it could just be tweaked to absorb these observations. The vast majority of evolutionists want to go with the tweaking. But there's an increasing number that says, no, it can't be tweaked, it needs to be overhauled altogether. They're never going to really abandon evolutionary theory, but they're honest enough to realize that these things are eternal. And some of them say we want to be free from externalism. And they recognize that these are rapid, they're repeatable, all these kinds of things. So they're excited, but they're in turmoil. I'm excited because, for once, we as creationists don't have to be lagging behind evolutionists and taking their crummy explanations ourselves, but just with a few minor variations on them. But we can completely reframe them from the ground up as if Darwin had never been born, get out in front of the evolutionists and frame this issue and frame the discussion ourselves. And that's why I said I'm excited about talking to a group like this, because I can talk to gobs of people, several hundred, but many of them don't have a clue of what I'm talking about.
But hasn't our paradigm been that God created this inventory of species and they've been kind of fixed?
Yeah, it is fixed. Not the species, but the kinds of creatures. Not the species, but the kinds are fixed, and they are fixed. But what you see here is you can see speciation, which is not the same as changing a kind on that. And so there's a big difference. We could even, and what I would expect to see is I don't expect to see speciation to go necessarily like this. I expect speciation to maybe go like this, or like this, a number of species like this and like this, because I expect creatures to be able to track environmental changes. So speciation may go up and may level off as the environment stays consistent. And species may tighten the closeness of how their traits match environmental conditions, but then the environment may rapidly change, and therefore I expect the rate of speciation to go up. So I'm expecting maybe episodic changes in speciation because of this.
What's the definition of a species that they can't,
Yeah,
they can only mate with each other?
that's what. Yeah, but that definition stinks.
Yeah, I mean, what's your
definition? The general.
definition?
I don't have a working definition, and I don't think anybody has a working definition. The definition that normally is there is that you take these two, and when they can no longer interbreed with each other, then they now become distinct species. And everybody for 50 years has known that that's not true, because we find hybridization all the time between different species, which are mating with each other prolifically and having offspring. Even Darwin's finches do that. So when I was saying that nobody really has a good working definition of speciation, that's not a cop-out. It's just that nobody knows exactly what it is. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you just mentioned really in passing the observation of replicating what changes occur, and I find that to be very contradictory to Darwinism. To think that if there is a change that you could retain, and an organization would, I'm assuming, according to him, environmentally, replicate the changes that are made. Because by nature, if you want to use Darwin's terminology, things are most aggressive to that which is most similar. You want to destroy that which is your rival. I don't want to get into an ethics type of thing here, but what would a evolutionist base his thinking on as far as why a change would want to be replicated when it would create an offspring that would take from your own resources?
Exactly. But now, I'll answer the question. How much time do I go? Do I need to end?
No, go ahead and answer this.
Okay. That's a brilliant observation, and it's right on target with what pure evolutionary thinking is about. Now, we've talked about natural selection, and I told you why it's a misleading concept. And it's inherently misleading, can never be made non-misleading, because nature doesn't have a brain, therefore nature can never select, and therefore nature cannot act like a real human breeder. That's a bogus analogy. But all we ever talk about when we flippantly use the term natural selection is survival of the fittest, or that this lived and this died and had the traits. But pure Darwinism, which gave his concept of natural selection the power, is exactly what you're talking about. Because he didn't just say some lived and some died. He phrased it in a way that incorporated Malthus into his thinking, where he said, in any one generation, more offspring are born than resources are available to them. Therefore, they compete with each other, exactly what you're saying. You don't want to have something that's equal to you, that you couldn't out-compete. They compete with each other for these scarce resources, wherefore most of them die, leaving the remaining which he called the what? Fittest, to reproduce and to start a new population. So his theory, and nobody really talks about it anymore, but it always had this, exactly what you're talking about, this Malthusian concept, where it's not cheetah versus gazelle, which is how everybody talks about it. The cheetah eats the gazelle, therefore natural selection has taken place. It was never that. It was always cheetah versus cheetah, and gazelle versus gazelle. Therefore, exactly what you're saying. You don't want gazelles with equal traits. You want some to be different. And that's how Darwin conceived of evolution advancing and advancing and advancing, because there was this competition for scarce resources, leaving the winners and a bunch of losers on that. So the answer to your question is, from an evolutionary theory, pure evolutionary theory standpoint, you would not want replicators. You wouldn't. It would not make sense from evolutionary theory, and that's why it doesn't make sense in evolutionary theory. One more time for one more question there? One more.
Okay, so I'm thinking about this continuous environmental tracking, and there's some instances where, like with the lizards, the babies or whatever, it's like in real time during their lifetime they're changing. With a lot of cases it is, and then there's other ones that they're tracking it, but then they leave it for their offspring. The offspring changes a little more or whatever. So I guess, is there probably the only way you can really know exactly which one it is research, right? It's like, is that going on? Is there some research?
Well, sure, this is research.
Yeah, but I mean, like by creationists, is there like an effort to kind of like figuring out what all the kinds are, and stuff like that? But this would be more like kind of determining which kind of changes are passed on versus happening real time in the individual's life. So.
Well, currently, in terms of just pure research like you're talking about, no, there isn't. That doesn't mean that there won't be in the future. And the main reason why there isn't because there isn't an interest or the ability to do it. It's because what we're really after is a new framework, a new model. The data is out there. The data is there in abundance. What we really need to do is come up with a better way to frame the data and come up with a theory of design, and then come up with models to explain adaptation, metabolism, those kinds of things. Come up with models, design-based models to do that. And so the reality is there's more data out there than there's enough people to read the papers and reframe it within a current model on that. But the model that we're working on allows us to make predictions. So I could make several predictions on things, and then if we had the money and we had the time, we could do our own experiments to see if that matches our predictions. So tomorrow I'm going to do a talk for the Rocky Mountain Group. It's going to be an extension of this. It's going to say how organisms are able to anticipate changes that are coming down. So not only am I tracking in real time, but organisms actually have a lookout capability to anticipate what's coming, so that I adjust today for what I anticipate is going to happen tomorrow. Now, and we know that organisms can do this, but nobody has predicted what the model how that'll happen. So tomorrow I'll make some predictions of what I expect to see in these anticipatory systems. Because this is an area where nobody knows exactly how it works. So if I'm expecting a correspondence between man-made things and God-made things, I can look at man-made, I don't want to steal my thunder for tomorrow, I can look at man-made things which have anticipatory capability, and I can predict that God-made things will have similar elements in them. So yes, that's a type of research, that's scientific, that's making a prediction. Nobody knows what's coming yet, so it can validate that. Well, thank you so very much, and back to the